Well, I believe this is now episode 5 of Wikipedia Wednesdays. Hopefully, the first one to get posted on Wednesday. Anyway, today is going to be Charles Darwin. Let's get right into it. Charles Robert Darwin was an English naturalist, geologist, and biologist, best known for his contributions to the science of evolution. He established that all species of life have descended over time from common ancestors, and in a joint publication with Alfred Russel Wallace, introduced a scientific theory that this branching pattern of evolution resulted from a process that he called natural selection, in which the struggle for existence has a similar effect to the artificial selection involved in selective breeding, something his family was known for. He's English, so these names are going to be mostly nice. Well, until he gets into some Latin, I'm sure. Darwin published his theory of evolution with compelling evidence in his 1859 book on the origin of species, overcoming scientific rejection of earlier concepts of transmutation of species. By the 1870s, the scientific community and much of the general public had accepted evolution as a fact. However, many favored competing explanations, and it was not until the emergence of the modern evolutionary synthesis from the 1930s to the 1950s that a broad consensus developed in which natural selection was the basic mechanism of evolution. Darwin's scientific discovery is the unifying theory of the life sciences, explaining the diversity of life. Darwin's early interest in nature led him to neglect his medical education at the University of Edinburgh. I've heard it said both ways, and I don't know how it was proper. Instead, he helped to investigate marine invertebrates. Studies at the University of Cambridge Christ's College encouraged his passion for natural science. His 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle established him as an eminent geologist, whose observations and theories supported Charles Lyell's uniformitarian ideas, and publication of his Journal of the Voyage made him famous as a popular author. Puzzled by the geographical distribution of wildlife and fossils he collected on the voyage, Darwin began detailed investigations, and in 1838 conceived of his theory of natural selection. Although he discussed his ideas with several naturalists, he needed time for extensive research, and his geological work had priority. He was writing up his theory in 1958 when Alfred Russel Wallace sent him an essay that described the same idea, prompting immediate joint publication of both their theories. Darwin's work established evolutionary descent with modification as the dominant scientific explanation of the diversity in nature. In 1871, he examined human evolution and sexual selection in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, followed by The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. His research on plants was published in a series of books, and in his final book, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Actions of Worms, 1881, he examined earthworms and their effect on soil. Darwin has been described as one of the most influential figures in human history, and he was honored by burial in Westminster Abbey. Beauty. That's why he's on this list. Biography. Early life and education. Charles Robert Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, on 12th of February 1809, at his family's home, The Mount. He was the fifth of 6 children of a wealthy society doctor and financier, Robert Darwin and Susanna Darwin, née Wedgwood. Wedgwood. He was the grandson of 2 prominent abolitionists, Erasmus Darwin, that's a strange name, damn it, and Josiah Wedgwood on his mother's side. Both families were largely Unitarian, though the Wedgwoods were adopting Anglicanism. Robert Darwin himself, quietly a freethinker, had baby Charles baptized in November 1809 in the Anglican St. Chad's Church, Shrewsbury, but Charles and his siblings attended the Unitarian chapel with their mother. The 8-year-old Charles already had a taste for natural history and collecting when he joined the day school run by its preacher in 1817. That July, his mother died. From September 1818, he joined his older brother, Erasmus, attending the nearby Anglican Shrewsbury School as a boarder. Darwin spent the summer of 1825 as an apprentice doctor, helping his father treat the poor of Shropshire, before going to the University of Edinburgh Medical School, at the time the best medical school in the UK, with his brother Erasmus in October 1825. Darwin found lectures dull and surgery distressing, so he neglected his studies. He learned taxidermy in around 40-hour-long sessions from John Edmonstone, a freed black slave who had accompanied Charles Waterton in the South American rainforest. In Darwin's second year at the university, he joined the Plinian Society, a student natural history group featuring lively debates in which radical democratic students with materialistic views challenged orthodox religious concepts of science. He assisted Robert Edmund Grant's investigation of the anatomy and life cycle of marine invertebrates in the Firth of Forth, and on the 27th of March, 1827, presented at the Plinian his own discovery that black spores found in oyster shells were the eggs of a skate leech. Motherfucker. Starting here again. Stupid phone call. In Darwin's second year at the university, he joined the Plinian Society, a student natural history group featuring lively debates in which radical democratic students with materialistic views challenged orthodox religious concepts of science. He assisted Robert Edmund Grant's investigation of the anatomy and life cycle of marine invertebrates in the Firth of Forth, and on 27th of March, 1827, presented at the Plinian his own discovery that black spores found in oyster shells were the eggs of a skate leech. One day, Grant praised Lamarck's evolutionary ideas. Darwin was astonished by Grant's audacity, but had recently read similar ideas in his grandfather Erasmus's journals. Darwin was rather bored by Robert Jamieson's natural history course, which covered geology, including the debate between Neptunism and Plutonism. Oh, wow. He learned the classification of plants and assisted with work on the collections of the University Museum, one of the largest museums in Europe at the time. Darwin's neglect of his medical studies annoyed his father, who shrewdly sent him to Christ College, Cambridge, to study for a Bachelor of Arts degree as a step towards becoming an Anglican country parson. As Darwin was unqualified for the Tripos, he joined the ordinary degree course in January 1828. He preferred riding and shooting to studying. His cousin, William Darwin Fox, introduced him to the popular craze for beetle collecting. Darwin pursued this zealously, getting some of his finds published in the James Francis Stevens Illustrations of British Entomology. He became a close friend and follower of a botany professor, John Stevens Henslow, and met other leading parson naturalists who saw scientific work as religious natural theology, becoming known to these dons as the man who walks with Henslow. When his own exams drew near, Darwin focused on his studies and was delighted by the language and logic of William Paley's Evidence of Christianity, 1794. In his final examination in January 1832, Darwin did well, coming 10th out of 178 candidates for the ordinary degree. Darwin had to stay at Cambridge until June 1831. He studied Paley's natural theory or evidences of the existence and attributes of the deity, first published in 1802, which made an argument for divine design in nature, explaining adaptation as God acting through laws of nature. He read John Herschel's new book, Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy, 1831, which described the highest aim of natural philosophy as understanding such laws through inductive reasoning based on observation, and the Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative of science travels in 1799 and to 1804. Inspired with a burning zeal to contribute, Darwin planned to visit Tenerife with some classmates after graduation to study natural history and the topics in preparation. In preparation, he joined Adam Sedgwick's geology course, then traveled with him in the summer of a fortnight in order to map strata in Wales. Survey voyage on HMS Beagle. I hope those beeps don't record, because that's going to be annoying. Survey voyage on HMS Beagle. After a week with student friends at Barmouth, Darwin returned home on 29th of August to find a letter from Henslow proposing him as a suitable, if unfinished, naturalist for a self-funded supernumerary placed on HMS Beagle with Captain Fitzroy, emphasizing that this was a position for a gentleman rather than a mere collector. The ship was to leave in 4 weeks on an expedition to chart the coastline of South America. Robert Darwin objected to his son's planned 2-year voyage, regarding it as a waste of time, but was persuaded by his brother-in-law, Josiah Wedgwood II, to agree to and fund his son's participation. Darwin took care to remain in a private capacity to retain control over his collection, intending it for a major scientific institution. After delays, the voyage began on the 27th of December, 1831. It lasted almost 5 years, so much for 2, as Fitzroy had intended. Darwin spent most of his time on land investigating geology and making natural history collections, while HMS Beagle surveyed and charted coasts. He kept careful notes of his observations and theoretical speculations, and at intervals during the voyage his specimens were sent to Cambridge, together with the letters including a copy of his journal for his family. He had some expertise in geology, beetle collecting, and dissecting marine invertebrates, but in all other areas was a novice and ably collected specimens for expert appraisal. Despite suffering badly from seasickness, Darwin wrote copious notes while on board the ship. Most of his zoology notes are about marine invertebrates, starting with plankton, collected in a calm spell. On their first stop ashore at St. Jago, in Cape Verde, Darwin found that a white band high in the volcanic rock cliffs included seashells. Fitzroy had given him the first volume of Charles Lynn's Principles of Geology, which set out uniformitarian concepts of land slowly rising or falling over immense periods. And Darwin saw things Lyell's way, theorizing and thinking of writing a book on geology. When they reached Brazil, Darwin was delighted by the tropical forest, but detested the sight of slavery and disputed this issue with Fitzroy. The survey continued south in Patagonia. They stopped in Bahia Blanca, and in cliffs near Punta Alta, Darwin made a major find of fossil bones of huge extinct mammals beside modern seashells, indicating recent extinction with no signs of change in climate or catastrophe. He identified the little-known Megatherium by a tooth and its association with bony armor, which had at first seemed to him like a giant version of armor on local armadillos. The find brought great interest when they reached England. On rides with gauchos into the interior to explore geology and collect more fossils, Darwin gained social, political, and anthropological insights into both native and colonial people at a time of revolution, and learned that two types of rhea had separate but overlapping territories. Further south, he saw stepped plains of shingle and seashells as raised beaches, showing a series of elevations. He read Lyell's second volume and accepted its view of centers of creation of species, but his discoveries and theorizing challenges of Lyell's ideas of smooth continuity and extinction of species. 3 Fuegians on board had been seized during the first Beagle Voyage. Then, during a year in England, were educated as missionaries. Ugh. Darwin found them friendly and civilized, yet at Terra del Fuego had met miserable, degraded savages, as different as wild from domesticated animals. He remained convinced that, despite this diversity, all humans were interrelated with a shared origin and potential for improvement towards civilization. Unlike in scientist friends, he now thought there was no unbridgeable gap between humans and animals. A year on, the mission had been abandoned. The Fuegian they had named Jimmy Button lived like the other natives. He had a wife and had no wish to return to England. Darwin experienced an earthquake in Chile and saw signs that the land had just been raised, including mussel beds stranded above high tide. High in the Andes, he saw seashells and several fossil trees that had grown on sand beaches. He theorized that as the land rose, ocean islands sank, and coral reefs around them grew to form atolls. On the geologically new Galapagos Islands, Darwin looked for evidence attaching wildlife to an older center of creation, and found mockingbirds, allied to those in Chile, but differing from island to island. He heard that slight variations in the shape of tortoise shells showed which island they came from, but failed to collect them. Even after eating tortoises taken on board as food. In Australia, the Marsupial Rat kangaroo and the platypus seemed so unusual that Darwin thought it was almost as though two distinct creators had been at work. He found their aborigines good-humored and pleasant, and noted their depletion by European settlements. Fitzroy investigated how the atolls of the Cocos, Kneeling Islands, had formed, and the survey supported Darwin's theorizing. Fitzroy began writing the official narrative of the Beagle Voyages, and after reading Darwin's diary, he proposed incorporating it into the account. Darwin's journal was eventually rewritten as a separate third volume on natural history. In Cape Town, Darwin and Fitzroy met John Herschel, who had recently written to Lyell praising his uniformitarianism as opening bold speculation on that mystery of mysteries, the replacement of extinct species by others, as a natural in contradistinction to a miraculous process. When organizing his notes as the ship sailed home, Darwin wrote that if his growing suspicion about mockingbirds, the tortoises, and the Falkland Island fox were correct, such facts undermine the stability of species. Then he cautiously added, would before undermine. He later wrote that such facts seemed to me to throw some light on the origin of species. Interception of Darwin's evolutionary theory. When the ship reached Falmouth, Cornwall, on 2nd of October, 1836, Darwin was already a celebrity in scientific circles, as in December 1835, Henslow had fostered his former pupil's reputation by giving selected naturalists a pamphlet of Darwin's geological letters. Darwin visited his home in Shrewsbury and saw relatives, then hurried to Cambridge to see Henslow, who advised him on finding naturalists available to catalog the collection, and agreed to take on the botanical specimens. Darwin's father organized investments, enabling his son to be a self-funded gentleman scientist. And an excited Darwin went round the London institutions, being feted and seeking experts to describe the collections. Zoologists had a huge backlog of work, and there was a danger of specimens just being left in storage. Charles Lyell eagerly met Darwin for the first time on the 29th of October, and soon introduced him to the up-and-coming anatomist, Richard Owen, who had the facilities at Royal College of Surgeons to work on the fossil bones collected by Darwin. Owen's surprising results included other gigantic extinct ground sloths, as well as the Megatherium, a near-complete skeleton of the unknown Celidotherium, and a hippopotamus-sized rodent-like skull named Taxodon, resembling a giant capybara. The armor fragments were actually from a Glyptodon, a huge armadillo-like creature as Darwin had initially thought. These extinct creatures were related to living species in South America. In mid-December, Darwin took lodgings in Cambridge to organize work on his collections and rewrite his journal. He wrote his first paper, showing that the South American landmass was rising, and with Liddell's enthusiastic backing, read it to the Geological Society of London on the 4th of January 1837. On the same day, he presented his mammal and bird specimens to the Zoological Society. The ornithologist John Gould soon announced that the Galapagos birds that Darwin had thought to be a mixture of blackbirds, grosbeaks, and finches were in fact 12 separate species of finches. On the 17th February, Darwin was elected to the Council of the Geological Society, and Lyell's presidential address presented Owen's findings on Darwin's fossils, stressing the geographical continuity of species as supporting his uniformitarian ideas. Early in March, Darwin moved to London to be near this work, joining Lyell's social circle of scientists and experts such as Charles Babbage, who described God as a programmer of laws. Darwin stayed with his free-thinking brother Erasmus, part of this Whig circle, and a closer friend of the writer Harriet Martineau, who prompted Malthusianism, underlying the controversial Whig poor law reform to stop welfare from causing overpopulation and more poverty. As a Unitarian, she welcomed the radical implications of a transmutation of species, promoted by Grant, and younger surgeons influenced by Geoffroy. Transmutation was anathema to Anglicans, defending social order, but reputable scientists only discussed the subject, and there was a wide interest in John Herschel's letter praising Lyell's approach as a way to find a natural cause of the origin of new species. Gould met Darwin and told him that the Galapagos mockingbirds from different islands were separate species, not just varieties, and what Darwin had thought was a wren was also in the finch group. Darwin had not labeled the finches by island, but from the notes of the others on the ship, including Fitzroy, he allocated species to islands. The two rheas were also distinct species, and on the 14th of March, Darwin announced how their distribution changed going southwards. By mid-March, Darwin was speculating in his red notebook on the possibility that one species does change into another. To explain the geographical distribution of living species such as the rheas and the extinct ones, such as the strange Macrochunia, which resembled a giant guanaco. His thoughts on lifespan, asexual reproduction, and sexual reproduction developed in his bee notebook around mid-July on variation in offspring to adapt and alter the race-changing world, explaining the Galapagos tortoises, mockingbirds, and rheas. He sketched branching descent, then genealogical branching of a single evolutionary tree, in which it is absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another, discarding Lamarck's independent lineage, progressing to higher forms. Overwork, illness, and marriage. A little sip here. While developing this intensive study of transmutation, Darwin became mired in more work. Still writing his journal, he took on editing and publishing the expert reports on his collections, and with Henslow's help obtained a treasury grant of £1,000 to sponsor this multi-volume zoology on the voyage of the HMS Beagle, a sum equivalent to about £82,000 in 2015. He stretched the funding to include his planned books on geology and agreed to unrealistic dates with the publisher. As the Victorian era began, Darwin pressed on with writing his journal, and in August 1837 began correcting printers' proofs. Darwin's health suffered under the pressure. On the 20th of September, he had an uncomfortable palpitation of the heart, so his doctors urged him to knock off all work and live in the country for a few weeks. After visiting Shrewsbury, he joined his Wedgwood relatives at Mayor Hall, Staffordshire, but found them too eager for tales of his travels to give him much rest. His charming, intelligent, and cultured cousin, Emma Wedgwood, 9 months older than Darwin, was nursing his invalid aunt. His uncle Josiah pointed out an area of grounds where cinders had disappeared under loam, and suggested that this might have been the work of earthworms, inspiring a new and important theory on their role in soil formation, which Darwin presented at the Geological Society on the 1st of November. William Whewell pushed Darwin to take on the duties of the Secretary of the Geological Society. After initially declining the work, he accepted the post in March 1838. Despite the grind of writing and editing the Beagle reports, Darwin made remarkable progress on transmutation, taking every opportunity to question expert naturalists and, unconventionally, people with practical experience such as farmers and pigeon fanciers. Over time, his research drew on information from his relatives and children, the family butler, neighbors, colonists, and former shipmates. He included mankind in his speculations from the outset, and on seeing an orangutan in the zoo on 28th of March 1838, noted its childlike behavior. The strain took a toll, and by June he was being laid up for days on end with stomach problems, headaches, and heart symptoms. For the rest of his life, he is repeatedly incapacitated with episodes of stomach pain, vomiting, severe boils, palpitations, trembling, and other symptoms, particularly during times of stress, such as attending meetings or making social visits. The cause of Darwin's illness remained unknown, and attempts at treatment had little success. On the 23rd of June, he took a break and went geologizing in Scotland. He visited Glenroy in glorious weather to see the parallel roads cut into the hillside at three heights. He later published his view that these were marine raised beaches, but then had to accept that they were shorelines of a proglacial lake. Fully recuperated, he returned to Shrewsbury in July. Used to jotting down daily notes on animal breeding, he scrawled rambling thoughts about career and prospects on 2 scraps of paper, one with columns headed "Marry and Not Marry." Advantages included constant companion and have a friend in old age, better than a dog anyhow, points against, such as less money for books and terrible loss of time. Having decided in favor, he discussed it with his father, then went to visit Emma on the 29th of July. He did not get around to proposing, but against his father's advice, he mentioned his ideas on transmutation. Awesome. Malthus and natural selection. Continuing his research in London, Darwin's wide reading now included the 6th edition of Malthus, an essay on the principle of population. And on the 28th of September, 1838, he noted its assertion that human population, when unchecked, goes on doubling itself every 25 years, or increases in a geometrical ratio. A geometric progression, so that population soon exceeds food supply, in what is known as a Malthusian Catastrophe. Darwin was well prepared to compare this to de Candola's Warring of the Species of Plants and the Struggle for Existence Among Wildlife, explaining how numbers of species kept roughly stable. As species always breed beyond available resources, favorable variation would make organisms better at surviving and passing the variation on to their offsprings, while unfavorable variations would be lost. He wrote that the final cause of all this wedging must be to sort out a proper structure and adapt it to changes, so that one may say there is a force like 100,000 wedges trying to force into every kind of structure, into the gaps of in the economy of nature, rather forming gaps by thrusting out weaker ones. This would result in the formation of new species, as he later wrote in his autobiography. In October 1838, that is, 15 months after I had begun my systemic inquiry, I had happened to read an amusement of Malthus on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence, which everywhere goes on from long-continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones destroyed. The result of this be the formation of new species. Here, then, I had at last got a theory by which to work. By mid-December, Darwin saw a similarity between farmers picking the best stock in selective breeding and Malthusian nature selecting from chance variants, so that every part of newly acquired structure is fully practical and perfected. Thinking this comparison a beautiful part of my theory, he later called this theory natural selection, an analogy with what he termed the artificial selection of selective breeding. On the 11th of November, he returned to Mayer and proposed to Emma, once more telling her his ideas. She accepted. Then in exchanges of loving letters, she showed how she valued his openness in sharing their differences, also expressing her strong Unitarian beliefs and concerns that his honest doubts might separate them in the afterlife. While he was house hunting in London, bouts of illness continued, and Emma wrote, urging him to get some rest, almost prophetically remarking, "So don't be ill any more than my dear Charlie, till I can be with you and nurse you." He found what they called Magaw Cottage, because of its gaudy interiors, on Gower Street, then moved his museum over Christmas. On the 24th of January, 1839, Darwin was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. On the 29th of January, Darwin and Emma Wedgwood were married at Mayer in an Anglican ceremony arranged to suit the Unitarians, then immediately caught the train to London and their new home. Geology books, barnacles, evolutionary research. Man. Darwin now had the framework Darwin now had the framework of his theory of natural selection, by which to work as his prime hobby. His research included extensive experimental selective breeding of plants and animals, finding evidence that species were not fixed, and investigating many detailed ideas to refine and substantiate his theories. For 15 years, his work was in the background to his main occupation of writing on geology and publishing expert reports on the Beagle collections. When Fitzroy's narrative was published in May 1839, Darwin's Journal and Remarks was such a success as the third volume that later that year was published on its own. Early in 1842, Darwin wrote about his ideas to Charles Lyell, who noted that his ally denies seeing a beginning to each crop of species. Darwin's book, The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs, on his theory of atoll formations, was published in May 1842, after more than 3 years of work, and he then wrote his first pencil sketch of his theory of natural selection. To escape the pressures of London, the family moved to rural Down House in September. On the 11th of January, 1844, Darwin mentioned his theorizing to the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, writing with melodramatic humor, "It is like confessing a murder." Hooker replied, "There may, in my opinion, have been a series of productions on different spots, also a gradual change of species. I shall be delighted to hear how you think that this change may have taken place, as no presently conceived opinions satisfy me on the subject." By July, Darwin had expanded on his sketch into a 230-page essay to be expanded with his research results if he died prematurely. In November, the anonymously published sensational bestseller, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, brought wide interests in transmutation. Darwin scorned its amateurish geology and zoology, but carefully reviewed his own arguments. Controversy erupted, and it continued to swell despite contemptuous dismissal by scientists. Darwin completed his third geological book in 1846. He now renewed a fascination and expertise in marine invertebrates, dating back to his student days with Grant, by dissecting and classifying the barnacles he had collected on the voyage, enjoying observations, beautiful structures, and thinking about comparisons with allied structures. In 1847, Hooker read the Essays and sent notes that provided Darwin with the calm, critical feedback that he needed, but would not commit himself and question Darwin's opposition to continuing acts of creation. In an attempt to improve his chronic ill health, Darwin went in 1849 to Dr. James Gully's Malvern Spa and was surprised to find some benefit from hydrotherapy. Then, in 1851, his treasured daughter Annie fell ill, reawakening his fears that his illness might be hereditary, and after a long series of crises, she died. In 8 years of work on barnacles, Darwin's theory helped him find homologies, showing that slightly changed body parts served different functions to meet new conditions, and in some genera he found minute male parasitic or hermaphrodites, showing an intermediate stage in evolutionary of distinct sexes. In 1853, it earned him the Royal Society's Royal Medal, and it made his reputation as a biologist. In 1854, he became a fellow of the Linnean Society of London, gaining postal access to its library. He began a major reassessment of his theory of species, and in November realized that divergence in the character of descendants could be explained by them becoming adapted to diversified places in the economy of nature. Publication of the theory of natural selection. Man, we just got here. By the start of 1856, Darwin was investigating whether eggs and seeds could survive travel across seawater to spread species across oceans. Hooker increasingly doubted the traditional view that species were fixed, but their young friend Thomas Henry Huxley was firmly against the transmutation of species. Lyell was intrigued by Darwin's speculation without realizing their extent. When he read a paper by Alfred Russel Wallace on the law which had regulated the introduction of new species, he saw similarities with Darwin's thoughts and urged him to publish to establish precedent. Though Darwin saw no threat, on 14th of May 1856, he began writing a short paper. Finding answers to difficult questions held him up repeatedly, and he expanded his plans to a big book on species entitled Natural Selection, which was to include his Note on Man. He continued his researches, obtaining information and specimens from naturalists worldwide, including Wallace, who was working in Borneo. In mid-1857, he added a selection theory applied to races of man, but did not add text on this topic. On the 5th of December, 1857, Darwin sent the American botanist Asa Gray a detailed outline of his ideas, including an abstract of natural selection, which he omitted human origins and sexual selection. In December, Darwin received a letter from Wallace asking if the book would examine human origins. He responded that he would avoid that subject, so surrounded with prejudices, while encouraging Wallace's theorizing and adding that, "I go much further than you." Lay down. No. Darwin's book was only partly written. Stupid dog wants to go out, but then there's noise outside. Darwin's book was only partly written when on the 18th of June, 1858, he received a paper from Wallace describing natural selection. Shocked that he had been forestalled, Darwin sent it on that day to Lyell, as requested by Wallace. And although Wallace had not asked for publication, Darwin suggested that he would send it to any journal that Wallace chose. His family was in crisis, with children in the village dying of scarlet fever, and he put matters in the hands of his friends. After some discussions, Lyell and Hooker decided on a joint presentation at the Linnean Society on the 1st of July on the tendencies of species from varieties and on the perpetuation of varieties and species by natural means of selection. On the evening of 28th of June, Darwin's baby son died of scarlet fever after almost a week of severe illness, and he was too distraught to attend. There was little immediate attention to this announcement of the theory. The president of the Linnean Society remarked in May 1859 that the year had not been marked by any revolutionary discoveries. Only one review rankled enough for Darwin to recall later. Professor Samuel Houghton of Dublin claimed that all that was new in them was false, and what was true was old. Darwin struggled for 13 months to produce an abstract of his big book, suffering from ill health but getting constant encouragement from his scientific friends. Lyell arranged to have it published by John Murray. On the Origin of Species proved unexpectedly popular, with the entire stock of 1,250 copies oversubscribed when it went on sale to booksellers on the 22nd of November, 1859. In the book, Darwin set out one long argument of detailed observations, inferences, and consideration of anticipated objections. In making the case for common descent, he included evidence of homologies between humans and other mammals. Having outlined sexual selection, he hinted that it could explain differences between human races. He avoided explicit discussion of human origins, but implied the significance of his work with the sentence, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." His theory is simply stated in the introduction. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly, in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving, and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. At the end of the book, he concluded that there is a grandeur to this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been, and are being, evolved. The last word was the only variant of evolved in the first 5 editions of the book. Evolutionism, at that time, was associated with other concepts, most commonly with embryological development. And Darwin first used the word evolution in The Descent of Man in 1871, before adding it in 1872 to the 6th edition of The Origin of Species. Responses to publication. The book aroused international interest with less controversy than had greeted the popular Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Though Darwin's illness kept him away from public debates, he eagerly scrutinized the scientific response, commenting on press cuttings, reviews, articles, satires, and caricatures, and corresponded on it with colleagues worldwide. The book did not explicitly discuss human origins, but included a number of hints about the animal ancestry of humans, and from which the inference could be made. The first review asked, "If a monkey has become a man, what may not a man become?" and said it should be left to the theologians, as it was too dangerous for ordinary readers. Amongst early favorable responses, Huxley's reviews were swiped at Richard Owen, leader of the scientific establishment Huxley was trying to overthrow. In April, Owen's review attacked Darwin's friend and condescendingly dismissed his ideas, angering Darwin. But Owen and others began to promote the idea of supernaturally guided evolution. Patrick Matthew drew attention to his 1831 book, which had brief appendix suggesting a concept of natural selection leading to new species, but he had not developed the idea. The Church of England's response was mixed. Darwin's old Cambridge tutors, Sedgwick and Henslow, dismissed the ideas, but liberal clergymen interpreted natural selection as an instrument of God's design, with the cleric Charles Kingsley seeing it as just as noble a concept of deity, just as noble a conception of deity. In 1860, the publication of Essays and Reviews by 7 liberal Anglican theologians diverted clerical attention from Darwin, and with its ideas, including higher criticisms, attacked by church authorities as heresy. In it, Baden-Powell argued that miracles broke God's laws, so belief in them was atheistic, and praised Mr. Darwin's Mastery volume, supporting the grand principle of the self-evolving powers of nature. Asa Gray discussed teleology with Darwin, who imported it and distributed Gray's pamphlet on theistic evolution. Natural selection is not inconsistent with natural theology. The most famous confrontation was at the public 1860 Oxford Evolutionary debate during a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Sciences, where the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, though not opposed to transmutation of species, argued against Darwin's explanation on human descension from apes. Joseph Hooker argued strongly for Darwin and Thomas Huxley's legendary retort that he would rather be descended from an ape than a man who misused his gifts came to symbolize a triumph of science over religion. Even Darwin's close friends, Gray, Hooker, Huxley, and Lyell, still expressed various reservations, but gave strong support, as did many others, particularly younger naturalists. Gray and Lyell sought reconciliation with faith, while Huxley portrayed a polarization between religion and science. He campaigned pugnaciously against the authority of the clergy in education, aiming to overturn the dominance of clergymen and aristocratic amateurs under Owen in favor of a new generation of professional scientists. Owen's claim that brain anatomy proved humans to be a separate biological order from apes was shown to be false by Huxley in a long-running dispute parodied by Kingsley as the Great Hippocampus Question, and discredited Owen. Darwinism became a movement converging a wide range of evolutionary ideas. Covering. In 1863, Lyell's geologic evidence of the antiquity of man popularized prehistory, though his caution on evolution disappointed Darwin. Weeks later, Huxley's evidence as man's place in nature showed that anatomical humans are apes. Then, The Naturalist on the River Amazons by Henry Walter Bates provided empirical evidence of natural selection. Lobbying brought Darwin Britain's highest scientific honor, the Royal Society's Copley Medal, awarded on the 3rd of November 1864. That day, Huxley held the first meeting of what became the influential X Club, devoted to science, pure and free, untrammeled by religious dogmas. By the end of the decade, most scientists agreed that evolution occurred, but only a minority supported Darwin's view that the chief mechanism was natural selection. The Origin of Species was translated into many languages, becoming a staple scientific text, attracting thoughtful attention from all walks of life, including the working men who flocked to Huxley's lectures. Darwin's theory also resonated with various movements at the time and became a key fixture in popular culture. Cartoonists parodied animal ancestry in an old tradition of showing humans with animal traits. In Britain, these droll images served to popularize Disney's theory of an unsettling way. Popularized Darwin. What the hell? Parodied animal ancestry in an old tradition of drawing humans with animal traits. And in Britain, these droll images served to popularize Darwin's theory of an unearthing way. While ill in 1862, Darwin began growing a beard, and when he reappeared in public in 1866, caricatures of him as an ape helped identify all forms of evolutionism with Darwinism. Descent of Man, Selection and Botany. Despite repeated bouts of illness during the last 20 years of his life, Darwin's work continued. Having published on the origin of species as an abstract of his theory, he pressed on with experiments, research, and writing of his big book. He covered human descent from earlier animals, including evolution of society and of mental abilities, as well as explaining decorative beauty in wildlife and diversifying into innovative plant studies. Inquiries about insect pollination led in 1861 to novel studies of wild orchids, showing adaptation of their flowers to attract specific moths to each species to ensure cross-fertilization. In 1862, fertilization of orchids gave his first detailed demonstration of the power of natural selection to explain complex ecological relationships, making testable predictions. As his health declined, he lay on his sickbed in a room filled with inventive experiments to trace the movements of climbing plants. Admiring visitors, including Ernest Haeckel, a zealous proponent of Darwinism, incorporating Lamarckism and Goethe's idealism, Wallace remained supportive, though he increasingly turned to spiritualism. Darwin's book, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, was the first part of his planned Big Book, and included his unsuccessful hypothesis of pangenesis, attempting to explain heredity. It sold briskly at first, despite its size, and was translated into many languages. He wrote most of his second part on natural selection, but he remained unpublished in his lifetime. Lyell had already popularized human prehistory, and Huxley had shown that anatomical humans are apes. With The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, published in 1871, Darwin set out evidence for numerous sources that humans are animals, showing continuity of physical and mental attributes, presented sexual selection to explain impractical animal features, such as the peacock's plumage, as well as human evolutionary culture, differences between sexes, and physical and cultural racial characteristics, while emphasizing that humans are all one species. His research using images was expanded in his 1872 book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, one of the first books to feature printed photographs, which discuss the evolution of human psychology and its continuity with the behavior of animals. Both books proved very popular, and Darwin was impressed by general assent with which his views had been received, remarking that everybody is talking about it without being shocked. His conclusion was that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect, which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. His evolution-related experiments and investigations led to books on orchids, insectivorous plants, the effects of cross and self-fertilization in the vegetable kingdom, different forms of flowers on plants of the same species, and the power of movement in plants. His botanical work was interpreted and popularized by various writers, including Grant Allen and H.G. Wells, and helped transform plant science. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in his last book, he returned to the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms. Death and funeral. In 1882, he was diagnosed with what was called angina pectoris, which then meant coronary thrombosis, a disease of the heart. At the time of his death, the physicians diagnosed anginal attacks and heart failure. Today, it was speculated that Darwin was suffering from chronic Chagas disease. This speculation is based on a journal entry written by Darwin, describing he was bitten by the kissing bug in Mendoza, Argentina in 1835. Based on the constellation of clinical symptoms he exhibited, including cardiac disease, which is a hallmark of chronic Chagas disease. Exhuming Darwin's body is likely necessary to definitively determine his state of infection by detecting DNA of infecting parasite T. cruzi that causes Chagas disease. He died at Down House in 19th of April, 1882. His last words were to his family, telling Emma, "I am not the least afraid of death, remembering what a good wife you have been to me. Tell all my children to remember how good they have been to me." Then while she rested, he repeatedly told Henrietta and Francis, "It's almost worthwhile to be sick to be nursed by you." He had expected to be buried in St. Mary's churchyard at Down, but at the request of Darwin's colleagues, after public and parliamentary petitioning, William Spotswood, president of the Royal Society, arranged for Darwin to be honored by burial in Westminster Abbey, close to John Herschel and Isaac Newton. The funeral was held on Wednesday, 26th of April, and was attended by thousands of people, including family, friends, scientists, philosophers, and dignitaries. Legacy. By the time of his death, Darwin had convinced most scientists that evolution, as descent with modification, was correct. He was regarded as a great scientist who had revolutionized ideas. In June 1909, the few at that time agreed with his views that natural selection had been the main, but not the exclusive means of modification. He was honored by more than 400 officials and scientists from across the world who met in Cambridge to commemorate his centenary and the 50th anniversary of On the Origin of Species. Around the beginning of the 20th century, a period that had been called the eclipse of Darwinism, scientists proposed various alternative evolutionary mechanisms, which eventually proved untenable. Ronald Fisher, an English statistician, finally united Mendelian genetics with natural selection in the period between 1918 and his 1930 book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection. He gave the theory a mathematical footing and brought broad scientific consensus that natural selection was the basic mechanism of evolution, thus founding the basis for popular genetics and modern evolutionary synthesis, with J.B.S. Haldane and Sewall Wright, which set the frame of reference for modern debates and refinements of the theory. Commemoration. During Darwin's lifetime, many geographical features were given his name. An expanse of water adjoining the Beagle Channel was named Darwin Sound by Robert Fitzroy. After Darwin's prompt action, along with 2 or 3 other men, saved them from being marooned on a nearby shore when a collapsing glacier caused a large wave that would have swept away their boats, and the nearby Mount Darwin in the Andes was named in celebration of Darwin's 25th birthday. When the Beagle was surveying Australia in 1839, Darwin's friend John Lort Stokes sighted a natural harbor, which the ship's captain, Wickman, named Port Darwin. A nearby settlement was renamed Darwin in 1911, and it became the capital of Australia's Northern Territory. More than 120 species and 9 genera have been named after Darwin. In one example, the group of tanagers related to those Darwin found in the Galapagos Islands became popularly known as Darwin's finches in 1947, fostering inaccurate legends about their significance to his work. Darwin's work has continued to be celebrated by numerous publications and events. The Linnean Society of London has commemorated Darwin's achievements by award of the Darwin Wallace Medal since 1908. Darwin Day has become an annual celebration, and in 2009, worldwide events were arranged for the bicentennial of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species. Darwin has been commemorated in the UK with his portrait painted on the reverse of a £10 banknotes, printed alongside with a hummingbird and an HMS Beagle, issued by the Bank of England. A life-sized seated statue of Darwin can be found in the main hall in the Natural History Museum of London. A seated statue of Darwin, unveiled in 1879, stands in front of Shrewsbury Library, the building that used to house Shrewsbury School, which Darwin attended as a boy. Another statue of Darwin as a young man is situated in the grounds of Christ's College, Cambridge. Darwin College, a postgraduate college at Cambridge University, is named after the Darwin family. Children. Darwin had 10 children. 2 died in infancy, and Annie's death at the age of 10 had a devastating effect on her parents. Charles was a devoted father and uncommonly attentive to his children. Whenever they fell ill, he feared that they might have inherited weakness from inbreeding due to the close family ties he shared with his wife and cousin, Emma Wedgwood. He examined this topic in his writings, contrasting it with the advantages of crossing amongst many organisms. Despite his fears, many of the surviving children and many of their descendants went on to have distinguished careers. See Darwin Wedgwood family. Of his surviving children, George, Francis, and Horace became Fellows of the Royal Society, distinguished as an astronomer, botanist, and civil engineer respectively. All 3 were knighted. Another son, Leonard, went on to become a soldier, politician, economist, eugenicist, and mentor of the statistician and evolutionary biologist Ronald Fisher. Views and opinions. Religious views. Darwin's family tradition was nonconformist Unitarianism, while his father and grandfather were freethinkers, and his baptism and boarding school were Church of England. When going to Cambridge to become an Anglican clergyman, he did not doubt the literal truth of the Bible. He learned John Herschel's science, which, like William Paley's natural theology, sought explanations in the law of nature rather than miracles, and saw adaptation of species as evidence of design. On board the HMS Beagle, Darwin was quite orthodox and would quote the Bible as an authority on morality. He looked for centers of creation to explain distribution, and related the Antlion found near kangaroos to distinct periods of creation. By his return, he was critical of the Bible as a history, and wondered why all regions should not be equally valid. In the next few years, while intensively speculating on geology and transmutation of species, he gave much thought to religion and openly discussed this with his wife Emma, whose beliefs also came from intensive study and questioning. The theodicy of Paley and with Thomas Malthus vindicated evils such as starvation as the result of a benevolent creator's laws, which had an overall good effect. To Darwin, natural selection produced the good adaptation, but removed the need for design, and he could not see the work of an omnipotent deity in all the pain and suffering, such as the Echinopnian wasp paralyzing caterpillars as live food for its eggs. He still viewed organisms as perfectly adapted, and on the origin of species reflects He still viewed organisms as perfectly adapted, and on the origin of species reflects theological views. Though he thought of religion as a tribal survival strategy, Darwin was reluctant to give up the idea of God as an ultimate lawgiver. He was increasingly troubled by the problem of evil. Darwin remained close friends with the Vicar of Down, John Brodie Innes, and continued to play a leading part in the parish work of the church. But from around 1849, would go on to walk on Sundays, while his family attended church. He considered it absurd to doubt that a man might be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. And though reticent about his religious views, in 1879 he wrote that, "I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God. I think that generally, an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind." The Lady Hope story, published in 1915, claimed that Darwin had reverted to Christianity on his sickbed. These claims were repudiated by Darwin's children and have been dismissed as false by historians. Human society. Darwin's views on society and political issues reflected his time and social position. He grew up in a family of Whig reformers who, like his uncle Josiah Wedgwood, supported electoral reform and the emancipation of slaves. Darwin was passionately opposed to slavery, while seeing no problem with the working conditions of English factory workers or servants. His taxidermy lessons in 1826 from the freed slave John Edmonstone, who he had long recalled as a very pleasant and intelligent man, reinforced his belief that black people shared the same feelings and could be as intelligent as people of other races. He took the same attitude to native peoples he met on the Beagle Voyage. These attitudes were not unusual in Britain in the 1820s, much as it shocked visiting Americans. British society became more racist in mid-century, but Darwin remained strongly against slavery, ranking the so-called races of man as distinct species, and against ill temperament of native people. He valued European civilization, saw colonialism as spreading its benefits, with the sad but inevitable effect that savage peoples who did not become civilized faced extinction. Darwin's theories presented this as natural and were cited to promote policies that went against his humanitarian principles. He thought man's eminence over women was the outcome of sexual selection, and a view disputed by Antoinette Brown Blackwell in The Sexes Throughout Nature. Darwin was intrigued by his half-cousin, Francis Galton's argument, introduced in 1865, that statistical analysis of heredity showed that moral and mental human traits could be inherited, and that principles of animal breeding could be applied to humans. In The Descent of Man, Darwin noted that aiding the weak to survive and have families lose the benefits of natural selection could lose the benefits of natural selection, but cautioned that withholding such aid would endanger the instinct of sympathy, the noblest part of our nature. And factors such as education could be more important. That was a brutal paragraph. When Galton suggested that publishing research could encourage intermarriage within a caste of those who are naturally gifted, Darwin foresaw political difficulties and thought it the sole feasible, yet I fear utopian plan of procedure in improving the human race, preferring to simply publicize the importance of inheritance and leave the decisions to individuals. Francis Galton named this field of study eugenics in 1883. Evolutionary social movements. Darwin's fame and popularity led to his name being associated with ideas and movements that, at times, had only an indirect relation to his writings and sometimes went directly against his express comments. Thomas Malthus had argued that population growth beyond resources was ordained by God to get humans to work productively and show restraint in getting families. This was used in the 1830s to justify workhouses and laissez-faire economics. Evolution was by then seen as having social implications. In Herbert Spencer's 1851 book, Social Statistics based ideas of human freedom and individual liberties on his Lamarckian evolutionary theory. Soon after The Origin was published in 1859, critics derided his description of a struggle for existence as a Malthusian justification for the English industrial capitalism of the time. The term Darwinism was used for the evolutionary ideas of others, including Spencer's survival of the fittest, as free market progress. Ernest Haeckel's polygenistic ideas of human development. Writers used natural selection to argue for various, often contradictory ideologies, such as laissez-faire dog-eat-dog capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. However, Darwin's holistic view of nature included dependence of one being on another. Thus, pacifists, socialists, liberal social reformers, and anarchists such as Peter Kropotkin stressed the value of cooperation over struggle within a species. Darwin himself insisted that social policy should not simply be grounded by concepts of struggle and selection in nature. After the 1880s, a eugenics movement developed on ideas of biological inheritance, and for scientific justification of their ideas, appealed to some concepts of Darwinism. In Britain, most shared Darwin's cautious views on voluntary improvement and sought to encourage those with good traits in positive eugenics. During the eclipse of Darwinism, a scientific foundation for eugenics was provided by Mendelian genetics. Negative eugenics was removed from the free-minded. Negative eugenics to remove the feeble-minded. Jesus. Were popular in America, Canada, and Australia. Eugenics in the United States introduced compulsory sterilization laws, followed by several other countries. Subsequently, Nazi eugenics brought the field into disrepute. The term social Darwinism was used infrequently from around the 1890s, but became popular as a derogatory term in the 1940s, when used by Richard Hofstadter to attack laissez-faire conservatism of those like William Graham Sumner, who opposed reform and socialism. Since then, it has been used as a term of abuse by those who oppose what they think are the moral consequences of evolution. Work. Darwin was a prolific writer. Even without publication of his works on evolution, he would have had a considerable reputation as the author of The Voyage of the Beagle, as a geologist who had published extensively on South America and had solved the puzzle of the formation of the coral atolls, and as a biologist who had published the definitive work on barnacles. While On the Origin of Species dominates perceptions of his work, The Descent of Man and The Expression of the Emotions of Man in Man and Animals had considerable impact. In his book, some plants, including The Power of Movements in Plants, were innovative studies of great importance, as was his final work on the formation of vegetable mold through action of worms. See also. Well, that was fun. Done this week. Check me out later for a little bonus with some featuring Darwin and a couple other guys we've covered so far, and see you later for another one of these. Man, I've been holding that for a while. Alright, hit subscribe. See you later.